So hello everyone, good morning. Let's go ahead and get started with our session today. I wanted to welcome you all to the Water and Energy for Food Introductory Week. Today we're focusing on one of the predecessors to Water and Energy for Food, the Powering Agriculture Grand Challenge. Thank you to everybody who's joining us today and throughout the week. I'm Augusta Abrahmse. I work in USAID's Energy Division, and I have managed Powering Agriculture for about the past 3.5 years. I'll be facilitating this session, and I'm really looking forward to a fruitful session and an interesting discussion. In the first session, we're going to learn about results and lessons learned from the final evaluation of Powering Agriculture. And in the second session, we'll hopefully make some of those results more concrete and personal through a panel discussion with two very successful innovators and our Powering Agriculture Investment Alliance partners. I hope you can join us for both sessions if you can. Some quick housekeeping items before we get started. I just want to alert you all that this is going to be recorded. This session is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Water and Energy for Food website and YouTube channel. If you have questions as we go along, please write them in the Q&A box on the right-hand side. You can submit them anonymously, should you so desire, although it's interesting to understand who we're having a dialogue with, so if you include your name, that would also be great. Attendees may like questions, and to increase the likelihood of my calling on that question to be asked of the presenters. You can also turn on live captions in English or automatic translation in German, Arabic, French, or Spanish by clicking the closed caption button below. So with that, I would like to welcome the evaluation team for Powering Agriculture, Keith Crane, Emma Thrift, and Brian Zuckerman from the Science and Technology Policy Institute, otherwise known as STIPI. STIPI is an organization that specializes in the evaluation of science and technology programs and has worked with a wide range of US government agencies, including the National Institute of Health, the Department of Energy, and NASA. I feel like they have brought a very interesting perspective to the evaluation of Powering Agriculture. The Powering Agriculture is a development program. Its core focus has been on science and technology, namely the development and diffusion of clean energy technologies for the agricultural sector. STIPI's experience with other R&D and technology diffusion programs has provided a very interesting perspective on both the successes and challenges experienced by Powering Agriculture. So with that, and without further ado, let me turn the floor over to Keith to share some of the insights from the final evaluation.
Thank you, Augusta. I appreciate the warm introduction. Our crew, myself, Brian, and Emma, decided we'd try to focus on the implications of the evaluation for We for Food, and so we'll be highlighting some of the findings we had that we think are germane or could be helpful for We for Food. Slide, please. So the purpose of our evaluation has been to determine first, what did PAEGC accomplish? What actually happened in the program? We then looked at the performance of the program stacked against the criteria, the DAC criteria of OECD, and then we identified factors that contributed to PAEGC's successes and failures. A very important part of the program has been to support that was provided in many instances headed by GIZ to support the primary part of the program, which was to support these entrepreneurs, but do so through knowledge management and technical assistance. We also drilled down in terms of Powering Agriculture's theory of change. We think this is especially important for We for Food in terms of trying to determine to what extent our grand challenge is really successful. And finally, we provided some recommendations. Slide, please. So I'll start talking about the program itself and the methodology. Emma will switch to outcomes, and then we'll move back to impacts and recommendations. Slide, please. So what was, slide, please. What was Powering Agriculture? What did it do? As a grand challenge, it focused on providing a set of solutions that had transformational impacts on major problems. We looked at, they tapped into a global pool of innovators and entrepreneurs, and also supported emerging technology in these companies. In addition to that, the program itself focused on clean energy technologies and agriculture value added, and it consisted of one of the 10 grand challenges. The total funding was about $48 million, of which roughly half went to individual grants to 24 different companies, and 3 aid organizations, USAID, Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, or SIDA, and then BMZ through GIZ were the primary company groups that supported this particular activity. So what were the objectives and what were the activities that were involved here? And first and foremost, the idea was to try to enhance agricultural yields and productivity so as to increase the incomes of small farmers. And they were going to do that both through improved operations, but also decreasing post-harvest losses. A focus of the program was to reduce spoilage, provide better storage facilities, and other types of activities in those lines. There is also an effort to improve incomes from outside of agriculture and to increase the efficiency operations of farms. The activities themselves, again, the technology and business model innovation was the core of the program. But in addition to that, especially in the last 3 years, there was an effort to attract additional funding from commercial financing, especially social impact investors. Finally, it wasn't useful just to develop these technologies and businesses, but to think about how to mainstream them, diffuse them broadly throughout the community and throughout the developing world, and to do so managing knowledge to transfer what was learned more broadly was an important component of the program. Slide, please. So now we'll turn to our methodology. So the theory of change for powering agriculture was common to all the different grand challenges. In this particular instance, the focus was to tap into new agricultural and technologies so that innovators could increase agricultural productivity. And in addition to that, another major focus or mission of the program was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. As part of the overall missions of the 3 assistance agencies was an effort to reduce rural poverty, although that was not a criteria of the initial awards, and also hope to improve gender equity. The theory of change itself, as with the other grand challenges, is the idea that there are complex problems out there, that these complex problems often involve more than one issue, in this case, renewable energy and improving agricultural output, and that there are all sorts of talent around the world that would attract new innovators that could come up with new solutions for these particular problems. And then powering agriculture would help to identify and support those entrepreneurs to not only develop the solutions, but also disseminate them broadly. Slide, please. Our focus in terms of the evaluation drew on the DAC principles from OECD, whether the activities funded were really relevant to the mission of the program, how effective the program was in terms of achieving those objectives, and more importantly is what factor resulted in either successes or failures. Efficiency was also an important criteria, especially compared to other alternatives. And in terms of impact is that what actually happened. Did powering agriculture really lead to results that would improve the lives of smallholders throughout the world? And in addition to impact, was there a real difference or just a modest difference? Finally, in terms of sustainability, are power and agricultural activities likely to continue, and were the activities environmentally sustainable? Slide, please. So our approach was to draw on this framework provided by DAC. We developed our own innovator success framework, which Emma will talk about in more detail. And we also drew on program metrics that Power and Agriculture adopted. And we then used outcome harvesting plus document review and interviews with all the innovators to come up with information which we could use to test our different hypotheses concerning the likelihood that the program was going to be successful. Slide, please. I'm now turning it over to Emma.
Thank you so much, Keith. Hi, everybody. So now I'll be talking to you about some of the information that we used to inform the evaluation and other outcomes that we found. So we heavily relied upon the WebMo platform, which is the platform that innovators uploaded updates and milestones to. We ended up talking to all of the Powering Agricultural innovators, and we talked to 2 of the 10 GIZ project innovators. We supplemented this information with a site visit to East Africa, so Kenya and Uganda, and here we were able to talk to 5 innovators, and we chose this region because it was heavily concentrated with innovators in sites that we could see the technology actually being implemented in the field. A really, really important part of this site visit was the ability to talk to distributors and competitors and others who had a really great on-the-ground understanding of how these markets were developing and evolving, and if any were experiencing success or other really important indicators of potential impact from the program. We also spoke with members of the Investment Alliance participants. Next, please. So Powering Agriculture projects spanned across the globe. Next. With 14 taking place in Africa, 8 in Asia, 3 in Latin America, and 2 in the Middle East. And we saw that they tended to fall into 4 different technological categories, and these will be important to the way we framed our evaluation. The first being solar-powered irrigation, cooling and heating, mini-grids, which is the largest number of innovator technologies, and agricultural processing tools and others. So when we were talking to the innovators and competitors and others, what did we ask them? What did we really want to know to help inform this evaluation? We wanted to know if innovators had worked with any local entities on the ground. How did they form these relationships? Are they still standing? What was the technology that they were offering? What was their objective to offering this technology? Who were they offering it to? And why was this area targeted? And how did they hope to provide technologies that would effectively help this area? And what did it achieve in terms of technological development, but also business development? Had the technology been able to be diffused? And we're focusing on these impacts as well. Did it increase agricultural output or incomes, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, decrease poverty, or make improvements in gender equity, like involving women in particular projects? We also wanted to know this extremely important aspect, what challenges did the innovators face? And this is a really important question to understanding, all right, what can we do better next time? How did these innovators overcome these issues? And who are the key players in helping them overcome any challenges? Next, please. So now we'll talk about this success framework that Keith alluded to earlier. Here we have 3 different categories that we divided the projects, each project into. So technology category, business, and diffusion, along this achievement gradient. And so I won't read through all of it, but I'll go through the business category and show this spectrum of achievement that we examined for each of them. So for a business had not achieved viability if the product had not been sold commercially, it had partially achieved viability if it was successfully sold on a commercial market, but it cannot be sold at a price that's above the cost of distribution, or it's unlikely to be able to be sold at this price. It had mostly achieved business viability if it was successfully sold on the commercial market, or if it was able to be sold at a price that covered production and distribution. And it had achieved viability if it had made sales of the product, was experiencing revenue growth, or had promise of becoming cash positive. And we also looked at external investments as well, and Keith will touch on that later. But we followed this trend with technology and diffusion as well. Next slide. So to kind of touch on some of the outcomes for each of the technology areas, we'll start with solar-powered irrigation. And this was a technology offered by innovators in order to do two main things for smallholder farmers, either to increase incomes by being able to grow crops in the dry season, but also growing crops that potentially held more value than others if they did not have a pump. So this product was offered in order to replace diesel pump usage, in turn reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We saw that all innovators within this tech area were able to develop the technologies, and that most were actually able to create viable businesses and expand on the market. We found that this was the most successful tech area, but that pumps were still hard to afford for the poorest farmers and the poorest smallholder farmers. So this is definitely something to consider. We saw within the tech area of cooling and heating a range of technologies from solar-powered refrigerators to mechanically powered refrigerators like you see in the picture, the EvaCoola. So this product was offered to help reduce spoilage for crops, fruits, vegetables, and milk, in hopes that this would give the smallholder more time to be able to bring their crops to market, allowing them to gain more money. We found that most innovators within this area were able to develop cooling technologies, and 3 created viable businesses, but only 1 innovator has expanded their market. And a successful innovator, Promethean, is now selling to commercial dairies, and I know we have G10 here today who will talk to you more about that. But we also found that this technology was expensive as well for smallholders, and a lot of the people that we talked to out in the field had either received their cooling device heavily subsidized or as a part of a trial from the innovator to kind of get this tech on the ground and within the community. Next, please. Within the mini-grid and microgrid technology area, this was offered to smallholders in order to provide electricity for those who were beyond the access to grid electricity or were in very spotty areas, so did not have a consistent form of electricity. And the main impetus for this technology was to provide a replacement for expensive diesel and kerosene for both agricultural and home use. We found that most of the innovators had been able to install and set up financially viable operations, with some still expanding these operations. And we found this interesting trend that mini-grids were able to spread the costs of the capital over a larger customer base, mainly because of the size. Microgrids were offered to smaller households or smaller areas of the community, not able to spread this cost over the larger amount of people, making it a little bit more expensive. And we found that these customers tended to be commercial establishments and communities. There's an interesting outcome from this tech area. Many innovators attempted to pair their microgrids and mini-grids with an agricultural tool, and we found that this was not as successful, and customers were not really looking to use this type of technology for the agricultural tools that were offered. They had issues, malfunctioning, things like that. So next slide, please. Within the agricultural processing technology area, this tool was offered in hopes to add value to crops through the reduction of manual labor and greenhouse gas emissions that would be emitted if the typical tools that use diesel were continued to be used. So we saw innovators had succeeded in developing these technologies, but most experienced difficulty bringing them to market due to technological hurdles and cost hurdles. However, we did see half of the innovators were unable to create viable businesses and sell their products. And we saw this trend of universities not commercializing their products. Next, please. So to sum it up, we found that most innovators were able to create these technologies. About half were able to create viable businesses, and most had not gotten to this technological diffusion stage yet. So with that, I turn it back over to Keith, and he'll talk about some market stimulation impacts and investments.
One of the key metrics or measures we think would be very important for We for Food is to see what investors think about the innovations that have been selected by the Grand Challenge. In this particular case, we found Powering Agriculture was very successful. Innovators mobilized just as much money as had been committed for the entire program, and well over double of what the amount of money that the program had provided innovators. The other half of the money spent by the program was in terms of other support activities. Not surprisingly, the for-profit companies were the most successful because they could focus on social impact investing, and they did have more of a drive for profits. However, nonprofits also raised a substantial amount of money. Over time, the choices that Powering Agriculture made of innovators in the 2015 selection pool seemed to be more focused on commercially viable innovators than the 2013 group. The 2015 group, even though they had much less time, raised 3 times the amount of money provided by Powering Agriculture. The 2013 group did raise more, but only 1.3 times. Slide, please. Also important for grand challenges is that the use of markets, and most grand challenges do focus on markets as the way to diffuse technologies. Part of their success is in terms of not just those entrepreneurs they funded, but to look at what's happened in the overall market. And here, Powering Agriculture had some successes. First and foremost, as Emma had mentioned, was that Powering Agriculture entered this field of solar-powered water pumps in developing countries at a moment that really resulted in helping to trigger a takeoff of this particular business. There are several pumps now in the market. It's becoming a substantial increases on sales year by year. And the fact that Davis and Shurtleff, the largest distributor of water pumps in Kenya, not only sells pumps produced by Powering Agriculture innovators, it decided that it was going to develop its own in-house pump because of the promise of that particular technology. Another area where we found that Powering Agriculture had a major effect had to do with mini grids. EarthSpark, which is in Haiti, has successfully deployed one mini grid, is in the process of a second. Its successes have contributed to the start of a World Bank program, which is now funding 40 mini grids throughout the country. Haiti, as you probably know, has had a very difficult time in terms of providing electricity to its people. The grid does not extend outside of major cities. This particular mini grid activity really seems to be a solution that would help disseminate power through the country. Slide, please. So what have been the impacts of Powering Agriculture? One of our primary metric here has been increases in household incomes. And so we looked at a variety of measures in order to try to ascertain what particular increases in household incomes are likely to come from the technologies. And in the case of solar and power irrigation, we looked at the ability of people, the monthly payments they had to make for the pump, and then that imputed then how much income they would need to buy those pumps. And since smallholders were, in the market buying pumps, we felt that was a strong indication that these pumps are providing additional income. As you can see, some of the one pump could increase household income by as much as $800 per year. For smallholders making just a few $1,000s a year in household income, that's a lot of money, and that's very successful. Outside of the market for irrigation pumps, we did find potential increases in earnings from dairies, from selling more milk. Here, however, as Emma has mentioned, the cost of the chillers were such that the net increase in incomes was probably pretty low. Although the increases in incomes we estimated for mini grids and microgrids look small, what that fails to indicate was that for most households, expenditures on energy are relatively small as a total budget, 8-9%, although very important for overall in terms of the household's well-being. And the mini grids were very successful in terms of reducing those costs by replacing expensive diesel and kerosene energy by solar-powered electricity. Next, please. In terms of reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, we found that solar-powered irrigation pumps could have a very substantial impact if they continue to be disseminated as rapidly as they have been. We didn't see a lot on cooling and outside of commercial cooling equipment. Promethean has quite a bit has had an impact, but elsewhere pretty small. Mini grids have a big impact in terms of substituting solar for diesel. And GIZ, which had sponsored 10 other projects outside of the 24 that it put under the Powering Agriculture label, even though they are really GIZ projects, had a very successful project in Kenya in terms of improving energy efficiency in the tea industry, which resulted in substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Slides, please. In terms of poverty and gender equity, poverty was not a selection criteria, and there were some tensions here, and I think it's important for those who are involved in rolling out We4Food to think about this carefully. Most of these technologies are purchased by individuals among smallholders who have more income. The poor smallholders usually could not afford these particular technologies. As a consequence, for smallholders in general, incomes would rise, but for the poorest of the poor, it's not real clear that this program is very successful. In terms of gender equity, the 2015 selection process focused on this more. All three of the assistant agencies have made this a high priority. There are many of these technologies are very useful in terms of improving gender equity. That said, for the entrepreneurs that were involved in developing these technologies, gender was, except with a few exceptions, was generally not their primary focus. Next, please. I'm now going to turn over the discussion to Brian Zuckerman.
Hello, good morning. So we're going to take a bit of a whirlwind tour through other aspects of the program, focusing on a range of other activities outside of the core Powering Agriculture awards that are still integral to the program, even though they were not the primary focus of this talk and of the evaluation. So moving on to the next slide, please. One set of key elements of the program is technical assistance, where Tetra Tech led the PASTO technical assistance effort, which provided innovators with a range of assistance. And sort of looking at that, one area we wanted to focus on for the purpose of this discussion is the Powering Agriculture Accelerator Program. So here, the idea was that as part of the overall technical assistance, VentureWell was subcontracted to assist innovators to accelerate the development of their businesses. And this effort was seen as sort of very helpful by the awardees in terms of helping them manage business problems, attract investment, and then through workshops connecting the innovators to investors in sort of helping to fund awards and to start sort of move the projects forward towards commercialization. So that's sort of one area. A second area of activities is sort of broader training and outreach, again, beyond the awards themselves. So we've spoken to you about investments in new solar-powered irrigation technologies, but in addition to that, there's a set of complementary activities led by GIZ that provided training much more broadly than sort of specific pumps on when to use and how best to use solar-powered irrigation techniques. There's a development and promulgation of a toolbox on solar-powered irrigation systems that's used worldwide, and that, you know, even in places where the Powering Agriculture supported pumps aren't being sold, these tools help to spread these new technologies to new kinds of farming groups. Another sort of training area is more actually an outreach area, is that Powering Agriculture supported its innovators to attend the SOCAP Social Impact Investment Conference, and that again helped to bring the innovators together with a range of investors, which facilitated moving companies forward, raising capital, accelerating business development, those kinds of things. A third area to talk about is knowledge management, sort of branding and press, where again, Powering Agriculture was highly successful in developing its own brand, and the program received substantial positive press, social media activity, sort of helping to spread the message of the kinds of investment at the food and renewable energy nexus that the program was intending to foster. The final aspect of the program to touch on is the Investment Alliance. This was another vehicle to bring funding to new projects and just new companies operating at the food renewable energy interface. This element of the program started late, but was seen as a positive anyway. And the Alliance focused a little bit later, rather than on the new technology development, but on companies that are expanding sales, sort of companies that are already moving into markets. So fewer of the Powering Agriculture awardees met the Alliance's criteria for investment, but this is complementing these awards by supporting later stage companies, helping them to diffuse their technologies more widely. If I could move on from activities, so going on to the next slide, please. Sort of pulling back from what we've seen and what we found to sort of questions of overall program success, and we're going to talk about these in the context of the DAC principles. But let's wait until the slide advances to that point so that you can follow where we are. So one more, please. So if you could please move one slide further forward. Sorry. There we go. So a question has already come up with respect to sort of sustainability. What does that mean? And sort of coming back to that. Sorry, go back to relevance and sustainability for, yeah, there we go. So when we sort of asked a set of questions about, underlying the evaluation, about, okay, now we're several slides ahead, I apologize. So we need to go back to relevance and sustainability at this point. All right, I guess I'll just start talking. So with respect to relevance, there we go. The core finding is that from the standpoint of, did the program support technologies that were potentially important for targeted beneficiary communities? The answer is, it is definitely the case that the technologies were intended to benefit smallholder farmers, lower middle income countries. That was the primary goal of the project. So certainly from the standpoint of, did the program fund what it was intended to, the answer is clearly yes. On the other hand, one thing that we noticed, and it's something that was alluded to earlier, is that the innovators who tended to be the most successful tended to target better off smallholder farmers rather than the poorest within targeted communities. And another point, again, that Keith mentioned is that, especially with respect to gender equity, the extent to which these projects moved forward the involvement of women in their communities was very difficult to measure. With regard to sustainability, we thought about it in a variety of ways. So the first few bullets allude to one definition of sustainability with respect to, did these projects continue, and did the companies that were supported and the other organizations that were supported continue to work in this area, offer the product post-award. One thing that we found is that the projects that were led by universities tended not to be sustained. There were pilots. They did not tend to be commercialized, although there are some notable exceptions. On the other hand, the projects that are backed by NGOs that are sort of that have long-term relationships, as well as for-profits, those projects tended to be sustained over time, even post-award. With the notable point that anytime you're supporting a for-profit company, even if the technology is great, that company may get killed off by competition if other companies enter a space. So the area in which the technology is operating may be sustained, but the specific innovators themselves may not, because someone else came in with a better version of that technology or a cheaper version of that technology, met the market more effectively. And so the initial innovator may not make it, but sort of the overall effect of stimulating a new market is the sustainability impact. Other points that we noted is that it is certainly the case that the organizations that were either headquartered in the countries themselves or that had deep roots and backgrounds in working in the countries where they were operating for their Powering Agriculture Awards tended to be more successful in keeping their progress going post-award. And then from a technology perspective, it turned out, and again, this might be sort of obvious in retrospect, the more complicated the technology was, the more expensive it was, the more exotic the components. Those projects tended to be less likely to be sustained as compared with technologies that relied much more heavily on off-the-shelf, easily produced, easily maintained designs and components. So moving on to effectiveness and efficiency. The next slide, please. So overall, we considered the program to be effective. about 3/4 of the project developed their technologies to, generally speaking, they started out at a pretty early stage, sort of advanced R&D. Most of them got at least to the point of something that could be tested in the field, and then 3/4 of them proceeded at least to the point of market demonstration, where it was being sold at least on a small scale, at least to some number of consumers in one or more locations. So from the standpoint of sort of bringing things forward and getting companies started and up and running, the program was highly effective. We looked at effectiveness, though, in a couple of other ways, sort of at a higher level in terms of building markets. At least in Africa, it can be said that powering agriculture can be seen as fostering the growth of the solar irrigation market. There's much more activity now than there was back when the program got started, 2012, 2013. Another kind of effectiveness is on the mini-grid projects, where it wasn't necessarily the technology that was complicated in getting proven out. It was much more in terms of regulatory hurdles, organizational structures that needed to happen for these projects to succeed. And in the mini-grid world, the most effective thing that it did was sort of helping these projects surmount these initial non-technological as well as technological hurdles. And then a final effectiveness concern, and again, we've alluded to this multiple times, is that the program has been somewhat less effective in developing technologies that can be accessed by very poor smallholders in lower middle income countries. From the standpoint of efficiency, there's, again, a few ways we looked at efficiency. One is, to what extent did these awardees bring things forward commercially compared to similar programs? We used some US examples, and the commercialization rate was quite similar, for example, to the US SBIR program. Other ways of thinking about efficiency is sort of within the set of projects funded, which ones were more likely to commercialize. And so big grants tended to be more likely to bring things forward to commercialization than smaller ones, so that the smaller ones were sort of less efficient from the standpoint of moving things forward. And similarly, sort of novel, complex technologies were less likely to be diffused. More established technologies were more likely to be diffused. Again, sort of from the standpoint of efficiency, staying with sort of technologies that started out further down the technology development spectrum tended to be more likely to get to commercial and diffusion kinds of outcomes. Another kind of efficiency is leverage, and again, as has been alluded to, the Powering Agriculture awardees leveraged more than twice the funding that they received in follow-on investments. And then a final question of efficiency is around timeliness. Sort of did projects move forward quickly? And timeliness was an issue, again, especially for the mini-grid projects, especially because of these sort of organizational and regulatory non-technological hurdles that the projects had to meet and overcome in order to advance. All right, so one final set of points, and this is with respect to this sort of overall theory of change in the program. So let's move on forward a couple slides. So the fundamental question underlying what we were doing in the evaluation is the kind of approach that the program took proven out from the standpoint of the results of the program. And so one more forward, please. So sort of one sort of high level design issue in Powering Agriculture is bringing new players into this space and thereby attracting innovative solutions, new ideas, and coming up with projects that would be different and yet highly successful. And so certainly the program did tap a range of innovators from around the world. On the other hand, it is the case that the sort of more experienced innovators, more locally based innovators, more established organizations tended to do better from the standpoint of getting to business development and diffusion than the newest of the new entrants. And then there's this whole issue that, the hope is that technology would really help to solve these big challenges in providing energy to rural areas for increasing agricultural output. And it is, again, sort of there's some very positive and some somewhat mixed results in what we found. It is certainly the case that there are examples of technologies that are helping to overcome these challenges. It tends to be the case that that the companies with existing products tended to do better than the sort of really the fully new technologies, sort of people starting earlier on in the innovation cycle. Some of what was most successful about powering agriculture was the non-technology side. It's sort of the regulatory side, the organizational side, market expansion, rather than sort of helping them overcome specific technological problems. Coming back to the sort of poorest smallholders in lower middle income countries was, again, a sort of an area where awardees had trouble helping to sort of help these groups to solve these huge challenges. And then especially with respect to the mini grids, sort of the links between the agriculture and the renewable energy aspects were sometimes not always there. The mini grids tended to be at least as useful to provide electricity for non-agricultural uses than for agricultural uses. But certainly, again, bringing new technologies, new approaches to solve a problem, even if it wasn't necessarily the specific energy for agriculture problem, was highly beneficial. And I will stop there and turn things back over to Keith.
Yeah, hi, just to conclude then, what are the key takeaways from powering agriculture for We for Food? And we had some very practical ones and a little bit broader ones as well. First, project selection is key. And here we felt, at least for the 2013 selection, some mistakes were made. One, definitely, as the committees get together, we strongly argue that they should favor innovators who have experience in lower middle income countries. That seemed to be very, very important. Those who did not have that experience struggled. The other issue we came to is that innovators really need to have a clear plan for bringing their technology to market. Especially the universities would sometimes focus on just creating a technology. It was not at all clear how those technologies would ever come to market, which is a key goal of the grand challenges. I felt in particular that more industry experts needed to be put on selection committees. There were some technologies that I believe would not have been funded if someone had been on the committee who really understood those markets, that the technologies, as Brian had pointed out, those that were very complicated or expensive components were unlikely to be successful and were not. Some of the innovators had suggested that for We for Food, potentially select projects in 2 stages. So instead of having 2 funding rounds, have a first funding round that would fund only projects at a smaller level, and then after a few years, then the committee would come back and they make larger grants for those projects they thought were most successful. Something to think about. I don't know if we call it a recommendation. The strongest criticisms we heard about the program from the innovators had to do with monitoring, and we echo some of that. There was a number of requests for information from Powering Agriculture that the innovators were just not in a position to answer, and most of that had to do with increases in agricultural output or incomes. They don't know how, they don't have any way to get that information. And so the way to deal with that for We for Food is fund a third-party evaluator to go out and look at what actually happened. We were very impressed. GIZ had a different program outside of Powering Agriculture project having to do with sweet potatoes. They actually went out to the fields and compared what the harvest was for particular plots with what it had been before. Those types of concrete third-party evaluations are useful. Asking innovators to provide this information doesn't get you anywhere. Another issue which has been difficult has been how to set milestones. Power and Agriculture have been very flexible about milestones, very willing to listen to and adapt to difficulties, like when a hurricane struck the project in Haiti. But some of the businesses had said that they needed the funds to be released so that they could meet the milestones rather than waiting for the milestones to be reached before funding was released. It's something to think about. And there were some arguments that sometimes the milestones seemed somewhat arbitrary. Finally, we would argue that the innovators were hopeful that when We for Food finishes, when it concludes, if the funders, donors could somehow set up some additional funding, maybe with a small new program to continue to support innovators. So many of the Powering Agriculture recipients had said the advice, and especially in terms of the contacts of social impact investors, have been very useful. They just wish that there was continued funding that they could continue with those contacts. So we wish you the best of successes with We for Food. We do feel like there's some lessons from Powering Agriculture that would benefit the new Grand Challenge, and look forward to seeing the results of that of We for Food in the coming years. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith, Emma, and Brian. Really appreciate that presentation, and thanks for everybody who stuck around. We just have a few minutes left for some questions and answers, but I will also mention that Keith will be on the following panel and will be providing some counterpart, an external counterpart to the other participants. So we can. Some of these questions I think I'm going to defer to, and because they'll be addressed in more detail in the following panel. And also apologies for those of you who had a little trouble hearing Brian. I know he was calling in and had some microphone issues, so we couldn't adjust the volume level there. So first, there was let me combine some of these so we can get through a few different topics. There was a cluster of questions asking about the business development metrics and wondering about exactly what stage the innovators were starting, and particularly the differences between the 2013 and 2015 cohort, and then clarifying the definitions of, partially versus mostly versus fully achieved on the business development metrics. So I'll start with that one. And then I hope you can go on to answer this more substantive, this more maybe philosophical question about that's as follows. The evaluation team spoke a great deal about commercial outcomes of innovators, but I was under the impression a large part of the portfolio was funded for R&D exploration, of which you would not expect commercial outcomes to be achieved. Can you help in reconciling this?
So let me take a crack at answering the questions. In terms of, we did try to look at the different outcome metrics on the basis on their own merits. And there was a wide range of different innovators that had been provided grants by Powering Agriculture, some who were doing early technology development, others that had a business had already had a small business, and others that were viable commercial companies. And so we did not say that if you were starting with a new technology, that somehow or another you were inferior to a company that had been in the market for 3 or 4 years. That said, as I had mentioned at the end, if you were developing new technology but had no idea or no plan of how bringing that to market, we felt that that was not in the spirit of the Grand Challenge. I mean, the Grand Challenge is to provide solutions It's not to develop prototypes, at least in our view. And so there has to be kind of an avenue or a view, even if you're only making some progress, to how to bring that technology to market. Going back to our coding for business development, if an innovator has not sold anything commercially, they did not achieve a business development outcome. Again, that is not an aspersion on an earlier company or organization that's developing a new technology. It's just a statement of fact. For partially achieved, the big difference between partially achieved and mostly achieved, and of course these categories are somewhat nebulous, had to do with cost. So if your organization can sell the product at a price that's above the cost of producing and distributing the product, we considered you as having mostly achieved the business development. If you were unable to sell your product at a price that would cover your cost, we consider that partially achieved, even if you've had some products there. So that's an answer to those two. In terms of the R&D question, it's an important question for grand challenges. Normally, from a company that organization that focuses on technological development, there are very specific stages in terms of technology progression. And what we find is that if you are really just doing prototypes or developing, experimenting with new, with new innovations and are nowhere near commercial production, then governments, if they want to support that, should do so from grants. But in our view, that with a focus on powering agriculture in terms of distribution, grand challenges may not be the way to go there. You would do more of a typical research grant, and then once the technology comes to fruition, then you can kind of think about whether it's commercially viable or not. So I think in some ways that's our focus. If some R&D is fine, but you really, again, I've stressed this over and over, you need to really think about how that technology could become commercially successful, because if not, it defeats the whole purpose of a grand challenge of widely disseminating a successful solution.
Thanks, Keith. So we're now right at time. I'm gonna ask one more question of the panel, but those who want to go on a 15-minute break now are welcome to drop off and rejoin us at 10:15, just to allow one more question to be answered. I'll also mention there's a handful of questions around this business, how do we do a better job of reaching more poor farmers with these technologies, and we'll go into that in the following panel. So just the last question, because there was another question previously about sustainability. Someone has asked if the ask for follow-on funding indicates a sustainability failure. What is your view on that?
I would not say that's sustainable. These grants are not extraordinarily large, especially the second round. Many of them were below $500,000. It's very typical if an organization is scaling up that they would need significantly more funds. In fact, that's what social impact investors do. In terms of the request for after program funding, that was more of a small grants that would cover travel costs, which would enable the innovators to interact with each other and with others and with potential funders. And that was the big, and to continue to get some technical assistance. Those were small asks, and it was more of a sustainability question. From my point of view is, here you put all this money in the program, you don't want to just pack up your suitcase and go home. It's good to think about some way in which you could provide some sustaining funding just to help these innovators continue with some of the successes they had. Not large amounts of money, but just a little bit.
Great, thanks, Keith. So since we now have run over, let everybody go get their break, and I encourage you all to rejoin us in 15 minutes when we'll have a panel discussion with innovators, and Keith will be present as well, and a representative from the Powering Agriculture Investment Alliance. And I think we'll be able to discuss a lot of these questions through the panel. So keep them in mind, and I'll be sure to save a lot of questions for the audience to follow up with. Thanks so much, and see you back in 15 minutes.